some 250 manufacturers and academic institutions have abandoned power distribution companies to generate their own electricity. This is a reaction to the high cost of electricity, few price hikes, and blackouts. The organizations have increasingly turned to captive power generation, producing a collective total of about 6,500 megawatts, surpassing the national grid's output of 4,500 to 5,000 megawatts. And notable examples include the Dangote Group, with its refinery alone producing 435 megawatts, other entities such as Pure Flow Mills Limited and Nigeria LNG also generate substantial electricity. Many of these companies, including MTN in Nigeria and Nigerian breweries, have adopted renewable energy sources like solar, while others rely on gas. Let's bring in Martins Arogie, who is partner at Energy and Natural Resources Group and the head of power subsector at KPMG Nigeria. He's also chairman power sector group at Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you for joining us on News Night.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we've seen that many this move perhaps is a direct response to the poor power supply in the country. Well, let me ask you, is this primarily a failure of infrastructure, policy, or both?
I think it's both, because if you look at the manufacturing industry, for example, you need to have reliable power. There is just no two ways about it. If I'm going to run a manufacturing plant and I have a process that runs end to end, where if there is just a slight cut in power, you could destroy an entire batch of production, which would have significant cost implications for those companies, then you can't rely on the national grid, because no one tells us in advance when there will be a grid collapse. So no matter what you do, given the instability in the sector today, which many people would argue is also a result of the failure of policy down the years, because it's policy that has led to also the infrastructure deficit we've seen in the sector, that has then given rise to the instability and the constant grid failures that we currently see. A manufacturing company cannot rely on the power sector as we have it today, cannot rely on the grid as we have it today, because again, like I said, it will be very, very cost inefficient for them. If you have, if you have the distribution company that has done everything within its own power to improve its own infrastructure within its coverage area, unfortunately, that distribution company is still subject to the national grid. So if there is a failure outside of its coverage area, it is possible that it will have an impact on it, and therefore on the companies that are within its domain. That's why you see that a lot of these companies have decided we would use grid power solely as backup, and when we are involved in actual manufacturing process, we would use captive power instead. And that's where we are right now.
Let's take policy for instance. I mean, when you say policy, which is also part of the problems, I mean, are you referring to policy in terms of reforms or regulations?
I think the reforms have happened. I think the reforms were very good policy at the time.
Reform started from when there was unbundling of the sector itself.
Yes, from 2005, 2006, culminated in the handing over finally in November 2013. So I don't think it's the reforms. I think it's how we then handled the reforms subsequently. I was listening to one of your guests earlier on while I was sitting down, and he was talking about the cost of power and how people are unable to recover their cost. And I think that was a fundamental issue in the past, where we, because of probably political exigencies, did not do did not take some of the steps from a regulation perspective, especially in terms of reviewing MITO, that's the tariff framework, and ensuring that people are able to also, because it's always been a chicken and egg argument. What comes first? Do we expect people to source for the funding from outside and invest in building infrastructure, or do we expect them to collect the money from consumers and then use that money to then invest in building that infrastructure? So what comes first? That argument is still there. It's neither here nor there. But what we know is that we need to have a policy in place that encourages people, that allows people to be able to bring in the required funding to invest in that infrastructure deficit. Otherwise, this problem won't go away.
In 2024 alone, I mean, the national grid collapsed 10 times. And of course, in 2025, I mean, the national grid again has suffered a collapse, even though the government has denied it, or the management has denied it. So what does it tell about the electricity supply state in the country? That's one. And secondly, I mean, if you look at the Dangote, like of Dangote, seen producing more than 400 wax, and some other companies have followed. So how is this likely to impact on the dynamics, market dynamics, and the competitiveness of the sector, seeing that you still have the likes of, discos, particularly the discos playing in the sector?
Okay. I think that's a very important question, because how does it impact? Because if you look at these guys that are going off the grid, they are a specific breed. One of the issues that most power companies have had is high collection losses. These are sort of customers where collection losses are almost zero. It's almost unlikely that you would find a big manufacturing company that is looking to bypass its meter or try to cut corners and stop itself from paying for power. So what you will then find is that the discos will then have very limited interaction with these guys who have who don't have collection losses, and that power then needs to go into the larger population where, because of how things are currently you may experience higher form of collection losses as a disco. That's one. Secondly, the higher the collection losses, because all of these things also get factored into deriving what the tariff should be. The higher the collection losses, the higher the tariffs you would find. So if you take out these guys who bring down that collection loss, who are high-end users of power, what you will find is that even from an economics of scale perspective, tariffs would obviously have to go up to cover for the loss of the revenues from this particular set of customers, because the discos also have certain fixed costs that won't go away. Whether you have 10, whether you have 100 people using the power, right, there's certain fixed costs that won't you can't reduce. So when you have a limited number, and these are people who are low income earners, having to then take the bulk of that power, it would lead to an increase, obviously lead to an increase in tariff, and then they will struggle the more to pay. And what then happens, the effect of that is that the discos can't recover their costs, they can't invest in infrastructure, and the quality continues to drop. So that's the negative ripple effect. Now, the positive effect people would say is that the power isn't enough to go around anyway. So if you take out the major users, then there should be enough to go around for the rest of us, the laymen, who need just one AC or just even the light bulb and the fan. The problem again is, do we have the capacity to pay for that power? So there are positives and there are negatives, but we just need to find a balance, and that balance must be one that ensures that we're able to bring as many people into the grid and give them reliable power.
I mean, energy, we've seen alternative, energy, like talking about renewable energy, becoming increasingly viable. Some companies are already subscribing to that alternative instead of the national grid. So how do you find a balance between, having to have a viable, national grid, or the conventional market as it is, where for those who take light from the national grid, and of course the people who are also subscribing to the alternative source of power. So how do you balance that market? How do you bring the two markets together in this case?
Okay. When you say alternative, you're talking about people going on solar,
solar and all
of that.
Because that seems even cheaper for some people.
It depends on how you look at it, but I won't go into the economics right now. But I think it's disappointing today that we still don't have an on-grid solar plant in Nigeria. And this is the 11th year since we started talking about it, when we initialed the 14-12 set of PPAs that were supposed to introduce solar into the grid. The world is very focused right now on climate change and its impact, and also deriving or developing more sustainable sources of power. So it is very important that Nigeria also takes a cue from that. Everyone will talk about our use of hydro and how that also adds to our contribution in terms of a renewable energy dynamics.
Right.
But we can do a whole lot more. Now, for the guys who are looking for those alternative sources, they're also looking at long term. A lot of studies have shown that over time, the cost of solar over a 20-15-year period, it's a lot lower than if you were investing in a gas or diesel generator. What typically would scare people from solar in initial instances is the initial cost of adoption. But from a lifetime costing, if you look at the lifetime costing, it's a bit cheaper than maybe even more cheaper than what you would find using the diesel.
Let's quickly wrap it up. For decades, you will see that Nigeria's power sector has faced, one challenge or the other, and yet for decades, billions of naira has been invested into this particular sector. I mean, do you think there is a will to really address that challenge squarely? That's one. And looking ahead, I mean, you mentioned the need for reforms, critical reforms, and I would like to ask you, so what reforms are most critical to ensure that the Nigerian power sector meet demands of businesses and other critical institutions, like the like of the Dangotes? So I mean, would be Dangotes that will come up. I mean, obviously Dangote is out of the equation right now. So wrap up now quickly.
Okay, so do I think there's a will? Yes, I think there is a will. There are times where we've allowed political exigencies get in the way, but when you live and you operate in a complex environment like Nigeria, I think it's almost impossible not to consider the politics of every situation and decision that you take when you're in position of leadership. But I believe that there is a will to fix the problems in the sector. I think that the decentralization of the grid is a very, very significant reform that has taken place over the course of the last few years, 2 years. I think that would also change the landscape significantly, where states are able to then, in a sense, drive and generate their own power sector market. I have some concerns, though, as to how viable that would be and how that is managed, because you don't want a scenario where some states begin to attract the relevant investment and others get left behind. Because whether we like it or not today, not every state has the potential to generate or to develop a viable electricity market. It's not just about generating power and distributing. It's also about the ability to pay. The federal government today still pays a significant subsidy for power. How many state governments can afford to do that? So if you're moving from the federal to the state level, there's still a number of issues that still needs to be resolved. Otherwise, what you will find is that some states will pick up and others will lag behind. So for me, it's about looking at that entire process again and say, how do we make it work? But decentralizing the grid, to me, it's very important, it's very significant, and it's a step in the right direction. It's how we then take it forward from there that's most important.
Group Head, Power Subsector, KPMG Nigerian Chairman, Power Sector Group, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Martins Arogie. Thank you for coming on News Night.
Thank you for having me.